Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of BackBeat, the behind-the-scenes look at Newsbeat, our podcast that melds journalism, social justice issues, and music. My name is Manny Faces, I'm the producer and your host. Each BackBeat episode we try to delve into the inner workings of our full episode. This time we are talking about our latest episode, Enemy of the American People, the U.S. government's war on journalism and press freedom. Before I introduce my esteemed colleagues, just want to remind everyone that all of our episodes and information can be found on our website, www.usnewsbeat.com, including a very important section that we'd love you to swing by and check out. It's a support page. Please swing by usnewsbeat.com/support if you are so inclined to help us cover the expenses of putting together the best sounding podcast in the world, specifically to cover our Artist in Residence program. One of the unique things about Newsbeat is that we bring in independent artists, tend to be hip-hop artists, who craft and deliver original verses to amplify and put an exclamation point on the issues we're talking about. It's what we do. It's why we're the best in the world. And the Artist in Residence program, which supports artists that you've heard like Silent Night and others upcoming. But we do ask that you swing by the support page and consider supporting our endeavors. So let's get into it. Once again, I'm Manny Faces. I'm joined this time, as always, by the Newsbeat editor-in-chief, Mr. Christopher Twarowski.
Newark in the house.
You don't live in Newark.
You do.
I do. And our managing editor, Rashed Mian.
Yo.
What up, guys? How you feeling?
Doing good.
All right.
Glad to see you and your pretty face.
Appreciate it. Back on Strong Island, Long Island, where I used to rest. Speaking of hip-hop and Long Island, rest in peace to Craig Mack, who just passed away, Suffolk County representative.
He was only 40-something years old, right?
46 years old, passed away, had been out of the music game for quite some time, but still a beloved artist to many hip-hop fans throughout the world. So rest in peace, Craig Mack. So, Enemy of the American People. This one hit home for us. This was a personal endeavor, this episode. We are journalists.
We are journalists. We are truth tellers.
Yep.
We are storytellers.
And there's been a what we call an unprecedented attack on the press freedoms that are guaranteed in our Constitution. Surprisingly, much of these attacks have been perpetrated by those who are sworn to defend our Constitution. Isn't that ironic?
Some would say that's fake news.
Yes, well, we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about, obviously, if you heard the episode, and we hope that you listen to the episode before you listen to the backbeat, because otherwise it's like watching the end of the movie before watching the movie, and we don't encourage that. But if you've listened to the episode, you do realize the depth of this issue, the importance of this issue. You know, it's the fake news term is something that's bandied about. You hear it left and right. You hear distrust of the media. You see the 24-hour cable news cycle. There's newspapers going out of business. The news industry, the journalism industry is in a weird state the last few years. But the work of journalism is probably the most one of the most important professions that we have. And we're not just saying that because we are of them, but it's important. And so we decided to go into this topic. We want to speak a little bit more about the people that we spoke to, some big players in the fight against journalism. This episode, Chris, you want to remind people who we spoke to?
Huge, amazing lineup. We spoke with John Kiriakou, the former CIA analyst turned whistleblower. We spoke with Barrett Brown, an award-winning independent journalist and founder of the online anti-justice civic ecosystem, the Pursuance Project. Barrett spent 4 years in prison for investigative journalism online. He crowdsourced a probe into the U.S. cyber military industrial complex, among other things.
Sounds scary.
Yeah.
It is very scary, terrifying. We spoke with Margot Ewan, Executive Director at Reporters Without Borders North America.
Right.
And we spoke with Trevor Tim, co-founder and executive director of the nonprofit Freedom of the Press Foundation. Special shout out to our musical guest and Newsbeat's artist in residence, hip-hop recording artist Silent Night, who, in my humble opinion, absolutely slayed this episode.
Yeah, I mean, shouts to SK. You've heard him on many episodes. Just, I mean, before we get into it, you know, you're right. That's why he's our artist in residence.
I think I had tears after listening to it.
He gets this, and he's able to put it in lyrical form, in such a educated and personal perspective. Like, he puts it all together, you know, and wraps it up in a bow, man. He's really, he's dope.
It was the first time too. I think that we sort of helped collaborate a little bit with an artist. SK wanted a little more input on the subject matter. Rashed, you sent him some links to some of the work that we've done over the years on whistleblowers and Barrett Brown. I spoke with him over the phone, and then I got to see him and the band Cold Fuse do the
the lineup artist showcase every first Saturday of the month in New York City at Sidewalk NYC.
I mean, I described it as a call to arms for journalists.
Right.
It is an anthem for the craft.
Right.
It is so inspiring, as you said, so insightful. The imagery and the purpose, really, of journalism, to me at least, comes through in a way that I'm just absolutely floored by.
Yeah, I think that collaboration you mentioned is just a testament to just how willing Silent Night and our other artists are to sort of just becoming part of the process and learning about these issues that they may be coming out of left field for some of them, and then turning it around and like what we like to say here is hip hop journalism, and basically using his voice to amplify the issues that we're raising.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
it's cool.
definitely. As an advocate for hip hop music and culture myself, some of the other work I do with the Center for Hip Hop Advocacy, for example, we often advocate, we all talk about hip hop's ability to be used in other areas, education and healthcare and technology, and working with kids and doing all kind of stuff. But hip hop as journalism, it just adds a different element that we love doing here. So shouts to Silent Night, shouts to our incredible artist lineup for all of our episodes. It makes this more fun to do, but it also makes it a much more compelling product. So yeah, we couldn't do it without you guys. That being said, as you said, these voices that we have on this episode are big players in this topic, this issue. But we also want to talk about some things that we didn't quite get into the episode that expand upon this problem. We want you, the listener, we want people to understand, as we said, this is an episode every journalist should hear. Because it goes to the heart of why they do what they do. But it's also important that every citizen
That's
hears
100% at the heart of this episode.
This is not for rat fans. This is not for journalists. This is for the people to understand what's happening to this foundational right that we have. The right, as I said in the intro, to our guaranteed right to the truth and our ability to speak truth to power. Right, and call things out when they're wrong, and when those rights are taken away insidiously in some cases and by our own government, this is a concern for every citizen. This is big. This isn't just fake news and keep it moving. This is important.
Right, and for those listening who may not know, yes, we do the audio, we do the podcast component, but each episode is also accompanied by a fully blown, in-depth, long-form narrative story on our website, usnewsbeat.com. And we use this backbeat here to talk about some of the things that maybe didn't make it into the audio version. So, Rashed, you want to tell us about maybe some of the things that didn't make it into the actual podcast but are in the cover story?
Yeah, and just real quickly, maybe just mention, just briefly, there, having John Kiriakou and Barrett Brown on this episode, I think is hugely important because they both were prosecuted for very different things under the Obama administration. And it was a presidency that in his first day in office, President Obama had talked about transparency and the importance of it, but really
siding with those who would reveal truths that need to be revealed.
Yeah,
and
but
then
when you got
saying, nah.
Yeah, when it came down to it, the end of his, some of the decisions he made, his Justice Department really undermined what he talked about when he came into office. John Kiriakou, really quick, was the first official to expose the Bush administration's use of waterboarding and other torture techniques. He did that during an interview with Brian Ross of ABC News, and it was 24 hours after that interview that he had, the authorities opened up what is basically a criminal investigation to John Kiriakou. He eventually wasn't actually prosecuted because of the leaks of torture, but he and his attorneys and his supporters believe that there's no other reason to explain why the government cracked down on him as hard as they did. Right. And Barrett Brown is a little known, unfortunately, in the mainstream, a journalist out of Texas who, as Chris mentioned, was sort of exploring the shadowy world of defense contractors that came to rise after 9/11. These are just private military or intelligence firms that the government pays to help, in war zones and with other matters.
Blackwater.
Yeah, those kind of organizations. Yeah. He sort of worked closely with the group known as Anonymous, the hacking collective, which exposed some really important stuff around 2010, 2011, and Barrett Brown published some of these things on his own site called Project PM, which was a collaborative sort of ecosystem where he and others worked together to expose surveillance of citizens and some other things. But yeah, so there's other issues that don't really get talked about a lot in the media. So obviously citizens aren't aware of it. But so when we talk about the erosion of press freedoms, a lot of it isn't explicit. It's little things that the government or law enforcement agencies or even corporations might do to go after journalists. So in one example, most recently, you had the arrest of up to 9 journalists who were covering the inauguration protest of Donald Trump. If people remember, there was what people would call riots happening in the streets of Washington, D.C., car windows being shattered, businesses being damaged, and some of the journalists and hundreds of demonstrators were just being arrested at once, and they were being charged with crimes that a few people were committing, but they were just arresting people en masse and prosecuting them. And some of these journalists actually went through full trials, and luckily a couple were found not guilty in their coverage for basically being through their journalism, they're inciting what was happening because they were amplifying the issues that were being raised at these protests. Another issue that is hugely important is the case of journalist Laura Poitras, who I think Chris and I talk about a lot, how sort of Glenn Greenwald has gotten a lot of the fame for the Snowden releases, but it was Laura Poitras who was actually the first person to be contacted by Edward Snowden. But even before that, she's been covering sort of the war on terror and the implications of U.S. policies abroad. And Poitras, it turns out, after she filed her own Freedom of Information request, found out that the federal law enforcement had been investigating her for 6 years, I believe from 2006 to 2012. Some of the things that they did were they would subject her to dozens of border searches when she was coming in from the country or leaving the country. She was being detained at airports. I think she was detained over 50 times until 2012. They would actually search her belongings, search her notes, and some of her electronic equipment. Poitras is a journalist and a documentarian, and she's an Oscar award winner. She won the Oscar for the documentary Citizen 4, which is basically a real-time look at the Snowden revelations. You see them sitting in the hotel room discussing and what he was revealing. So she was being investigated by the government for many years. And
did they think that they were, not to cut you off, did they think that she was in cahoots with
terror organizations?
Yeah.
Apparently,
what's their justification?
Apparently, their justification, but obviously there was no criminal charges. She was never actually, there was ever no evidence of wrongdoing. So apparently, there is no longer an investigation as far as we know. But they sort of honed in on her after there was an ambush of some American forces in, I believe, Baghdad, and she had happened to be on the roof just recording what was going on during the war. I mean, this is, I believe, 2004, so there was fierce fighting going on,
right?
In Iraq and Afghanistan.
Correspondent at this point,
basically.
Right.
So they were trying to, I guess, insinuating that she may have prior knowledge of the attack if she happened to be there at the same time. There was an ambush of American citizens, which of course she denies.
So they thought she was Spider-Man.
Yes,
got it. Okay, understand.
So these are just some of the little cases that are happening. The CNNs and MSNBCs and the other mainstream outlets, corporate newspapers, rightly are defending and sort of pushing back against President Donald Trump for his invoking a free press every time he's confronted with stories that don't do his administration any good. But these are things that are not being talked about. These are like the little things that could possibly lead to the erosion of the First Amendment, and are probably things that should be discussed.
Right, which is why we discuss them. I talk to a lot of people, average, everyday people, and that media distrust is an issue, right? So I think that sometimes when people hear the fake news or the freedom of the press or the press is under attack, a lot of people think of the news media as being sort of circus-like in of itself. Again, the 24-hour cable news cycle, always having these commentating talking heads, these experts all parsing these subjects for hours on end. And I think that sometimes the general public thinks that the news and journalism is just not as important as it used to be. So what are the dangers to the average American person who doesn't understand or doesn't, or isn't fully versed on the Barrett Browns of the world, what they went to jail for? Put it in context for everyday people, why citizens need to be, I think, wary of what's happening here.
Well, in your introduction to the episode, you spoke about how freedom of the press is at the bedrock of democracy. They call journalists the fourth estate. It holds those in power accountable. It holds them to the words. It holds them to their actions. It alerts the public. It informs the public. Without that, as you rightfully said too, it's really not much of a democracy now, is it? Without that system of checks, accountability, really, they can do whatever they want. So there's that.
And if we want like an actual example of why it's important, let's bring it into the conversation we're having about whistleblowers and journalism. Reality Winner, who was a contractor working for the NSA, was the first whistleblower charged under the Espionage Act in the Trump administration. She allegedly sent documents to The Intercept that were classified, not to be revealed, that showed that a Russian cyber attack targeting the supplier of U.S. voting software. So this is the actual software that's being targeted to perhaps undermine our elections. This is not disinformation campaigns on social media. This is a direct attack on the software. And for all the coverage about Russian intrusion, this is perhaps the most important story that's come out of it, even though it doesn't get addressed much. Because of the actual implications, when someone goes to vote, you want to make sure the software is secure. Without that knowledge, state governments, state board of elections may not be fortifying their software when it comes to a major election.
Right.
So without that information that she allegedly exposed, perhaps there'd be, officials wouldn't be going to great extents to protect this institution, which is important.
Right.
It speaks to the heart, the right to know.
Right.
Without freedom of the press, everything else is propaganda.
And when you talk about military contract, I guess people who work, sometimes civilians who work for the military that come across this information. Was Snowden a civilian, right?
Yeah, Snowden was a contractor.
Right.
I think the Washington Post estimated years ago that there's maybe about 60 or 70% of defense workers are contractors.
Okay, so you have basic, you have citizens that are discovering information in the course of their work, allegedly. Some of it classified, some of it not. But that doesn't seem to be reaching the right gatekeepers. There doesn't seem to be action being taken on some of these important things, as we spoke to in the Chelsea Manning episode that we did, right? Same thing with her, with some of this information that's not getting to the public. You said the right to know, the right to understand what's going on. And it's, I guess, a tricky situation when the government, which is charged with protecting these secrets, is the one that is finding out about these secrets getting out, their secrets getting out, and then they have to now play this game of protecting national security, which I think is vital. You can't have everybody spilling secrets willy-nilly. So that's the predicament we're in, right? We have information sometimes that needs to get out, but we persecute people who are whistleblowing or journalists that are digging.
Yeah.
So where's the protection for the people? How do we circumvent that? How do we go? We can't go around the government if they're the ones pulling the strings, right?
Right. And
isn't that's right?
That is the predicament that we're in right now. And it's sort of, I want to go back to something that James Risen, who was actually subpoenaed to testify in the trial of another leaker. He was a New York Times reporter, now with The Intercept, an investigative reporter who's covered the CIA for years. And recently he had a discussion, I think on Intercepted, fellow podcast, where he talked about, or he wrote about, that back in the day, these CIA officers and clandestine officers were it was okay to talk to journalists because the higher ups thought, let them get some of this information out so they don't actually in the future expose something more sinister. They actually thought it was healthy for people to talk to journalists about this stuff.
Right.
Lower level guys. But now, after 9/11, there's been a huge crackdown. President Obama, his DOJ prosecuted the most people under the whistleblower than all presidents combined.
Right.
So that's, I believe, 9. So this crackdown has sort of also led to a chilling effect where you don't know how many people are out there that have actually wanted to leak information, but now
Right.
they're too frightened.
Right.
Some news organizations have created software, secure software on their sites to help people
Anonymously drop.
That's what
information.
Chelsea Manning did with WikiLeaks. She tried to get in touch with news organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post and also Politico, but they didn't respond, and that was her best way of getting this information out. So there is ways that news organizations are trying to circumvent that, as you said. Obviously, they can't be seen to be looking for this information. Otherwise, that possibly could be a crime because you're
Right. And I would think that people are still going to be afraid to even do that much because they know the penalties are so harsh.
Yeah, you're getting charged under the Espionage Act,
and
which is
that's
a World
huge-
War I era law meant to prosecute spies.
That's a big law too. Like that'll get you.
Well, and it also
You'll go on vacation for a
Barrett
minute.
Brown, to put in context, I mean, Barrett Brown was facing over 100 years
Right.
in prison.
Yeah. It's probably like, it's
originally.
one of the I would say the most biggest charges, federal charges that you could be brought up against.
Well,
It's treason or something.
You really
right?
don't want to get hit with that one. If you're thinking about,
No, I'm just
getting
saying,
hit with that-
like, if I have some information,
it's also
I don't know, 100 years is a
they're
long time.
strategically using that act because it also you're limited to the way in which you could defend yourself in the court of law. You can't. Lawyers say you can't have a public defense because you can't say I did this because it was right for the public to know this. Like, you can't defend yourself
they sort of
in that way.
kneecap you right off at the
Yeah.
at the-
So, but with Barrett Brown, I mean, the egregious thing about Brown, as Chris mentioned, is that he was charged with, at one point, just sharing a publicly available link. Literally a link that was out there on the web, and he put it in his Project PM chat, and he had initially been charged with that. Again, there was his critics saying he was being overcharged, possibly to lead to a eventual guilty plea, which he did cop to, and he served about 5.5 months, if I have that correctly, in prison. But it just shows just how sort of forceful the government has become in prosecuting or trying to prosecute whistleblowers and journalists. And people, I think it's important to note. Trevor Tim mentions this in our episode that these two things are not different. When you're going after whistleblowers, you're going after the freedom of the press, because without whistleblowers, journalists are not getting important information out to the public. Right. And as Chris mentioned, if that's the scenario in which we're going to be going in the future, then all we're going to be getting is government propaganda.
Right. And you find that now, I think, when you look at the daily press briefings from the White House and you get the pool reporters who are there, and it's like I'm watching a movie. I'm yelling at them like, ask this question or, push back. And sometimes I think they can't because of the nature of the press briefings. They're sort of voluntary. The White House could actually not do them if they don't want to. They could kick you out if you start asking too many questions. So it's like not only these specific examples, but it's this atmosphere of you can't push too hard or there will be consequences. That's part of it too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least a part of it also you have to look at is, like you said, the herd mentality. We have mainstream media, we have independent, media, alternative media. But I think, at least, I don't, know an exact example, but they want the access.
Right.
They want to be the rock star.
You want to be the White House correspondent.
They
wanna
want to
be
be the
yeah.
White House correspondent and everything that comes
So you
along
do what you
with that.
can,
So
but-
you toe
Yeah.
the state line, you act the way you're supposed to act,
Right.
and you get into those briefing rooms.
Yeah.
And
if you dare push back, you're Jim Acosta at CNN and you're screamed at like a child, as we saw in the episode.
Don't be rude.
Don't be rude.
Don't be rude.
I'm not going to answer your question. Fake news. Your organization is horrible. And unfortunately, because this is the bully pulpit, people hear this and they get this in their head that Jim Acosta, by asking more pointed or more direct questions, is being rude somehow. It is out of line.
I think journalists should be rude.
Well, you guys are exceptionally rude.
there's a quote by an unbelievable investigative journalist, Rashed and I both look up to, Bob Greene from Newsday, one of the first, I think the first American investigative journalist to found the team investigative unit at a major daily newspaper in the U.S. But he said something along the lines of, the founding fathers didn't give us the First Amendment to publish apple pie recipes.
Right.
For many years with the Long Island Press, we hosted the High School Journalism Awards contest here on Long Island. And one of the things that I like to say is journalism, it gives you this magic license, right, to go to anybody, no matter if they're the top executive, no matter if they're the president of the United States, no matter if they're a sewage worker, and ask them the questions that matter most to the people and are in the public's good. If you don't exercise that, then yeah, you could probably get the clicks and probably a hell of a lot more money writing about
Apple
Kim
pie
Kardashian's tuchus or Justin Bieber's tattoo.
Right.
Did we just say tuchus on one of these episodes? Yes,
Isn't
we
it
did.
tuchus? Is it tuchus or tuchus?
I like to say tuchus.
Yeah, this is the Twarowski clan's dialect.
Yeah. And Silent Night touched upon this in some of his verse, the voice of the voiceless, shining a light on the dark places, exposing those things that those with a lot of power do not want out.
Right.
And so we talk about the war on whistleblowers, the chilling effect. We talk about the fake news, the campaign to delegitimize the press. And yes, it is a circus show many times.
Right.
At the core is this quest to hold those in power accountable and to inform the public. And sometimes that takes the form of outright surveillance of AP journalists, seizing their phone records, which has happened here in the United States.
Naming a Fox News reporter a co-conspirator in one leak case, an actual co-conspirator.
There you go.
Right.
So some of these attacks that
suing them to name sources. Isn't that something that happened as well?
That's the case of James Risen, who, so basically, again, with Risen, he was working on an article for months. Definitely should check out James Risen's piece where he talks about sort of how the New York Times and the U.S. government worked hand in hand to stifle one of his big stories. So he was working on a story about how the CIA botched an operation to sabotage the Iran nuclear operation, and it was supposed to be an article in the New York Times that eventually was taking too long to get out. So he put it in a chapter of his book called State of War, and the government came down hard, and they were prosecuting a CIA officer named Jeffrey Sterling for allegedly leaking that information, and they wanted Risen to testify at his case to basically say, yeah, that was my source, which Risen refused and kept refusing until the government finally relented. Eric Holder's DOJ finally relented. But it's just, just pressuring journalists to try to reveal those sources. And it's something that's actually happening right now that not a lot of people are talking about, and which surprised me too, is if you go to the Freedom of Press Foundation's website, they are documenting not only attacks on journalists, arrests of journalists, which typically happen during protests, but also now they're looking into the amount of subpoenas that are being handed out to journalists for their information. In one case, there's a journalist out in San Diego, a freelancer, who was working on a story about deaths at a county jail in San Diego, and the authorities are subpoenaed this journalist and asked her for even unpublished material that she had on this jail story. So I think the number now is a half dozen subpoenas, and it's only March.
And that's one thing I wanted to get at. You actually segued into it nicely, because this isn't just federal classified documents, war crimes, all these things that are coming, Watergate level stuff, collusion. It's not just that, but it is local. It does trickle down locally. It is your community journalists. It is deaths at a county jail. Let's not forget, again, with all the people who say, the news, they're full of it these days. Let's not forget the Roy Moore accusations of sexual misconduct, with minors, whether you believe them or not, whatever the case may be, that was exposed.
Stephanie McCrudden from the Washington Post.
Exactly. Investigative journalism, which everyone, I don't care what you think about Roy Moore and all that, but you definitely would say that the exposure of the sex abuse by the Olympic doctor was not fake news, was absolutely important to
or Harvey Weinstein
right. And those were all exposed by local level
Yep.
investigative journalism. So if you start pushing back against this on a grand scale, if that atmosphere that we see from the administration, and not just this administration, again, to be fair,
crosses party lines,
right, across the board, this fight against the ability of the press to do not only their job, but their duty, and not only their duty, but our nation's duty to let them do that job. If you start pushing it, this atmosphere created trickles down to the local level, you're not exposing Larry Nassar for the I can't even say, like, I'm speechless to use an adjective to describe the crimes that he committed against those young women for all those years. That's journalism did that. So yes, we can have these feelings about the 24-hour news cycle and, but if that atmosphere, if this attack on press freedom trickles down to those journalists, you're not getting those stories.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, people, it gets lost in the circus. It gets lost in the chaos. People need to understand and really know and embrace. Journalists act in your best interests. The truth. The way I see journalism, we are like the last defense of the public. I think it's important to know too. So we talk about the policies, we talk about the crackdown on whistleblowers, and what often gets lost, I think, and what most people don't realize is journalists risk their lives to get at the truth, have lost their lives to get at the truth. Silent Night calls it blood ink in his rhymes, and that is what it is. It's worth mentioning just a couple historical and recent casualties of journalists who lost their lives simply in the pursuit of the truth to inform the public. A famous case, maybe not so famous, should be investigative journalist named Don Bowles for the Arizona Republic, was following up a tip about some land deals potentially connected to the mafia. Goes to meet a source at a hotel. Nobody shows up, goes back to his car. The car blows up. He's killed instantly. What came of that was what I would consider, and I think Rashed probably, one of United States journalism's finest moments, called the Arizona Project, where editors and writers from newspapers across the country donated their vacation time to swarm down on Arizona to investigate that slaying, and resulted in, I think it was a series, 30 different stories, spanned dozens of publications all at once across the country. To date, never really been done before. The head of that was also the journalist we mentioned earlier, Bob Greene, and went on to form one of the most reputable nonprofits out there in terms of press freedoms and journalism, the IRE, or Investigative Reporters and Editors. Just last year, Daphne Caruana Galizia, an investigative journalist in Malta, got slaughtered by a car bomb. She just strangely, I think if there was anything close to that level of the Arizona Project, it was probably the Panama Papers. And she was working on that, which those who may not know, more than 11 million undisclosed financial and personal documents for, leaders and executives all across the globe were leaked. And again, journalists, this time from across different countries, banded together to get that out to the public. She was killed. Press freedoms in the United States is a hard-fought and hard-won right. And there's a reason it's enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution. The responsibility is great. And, I just wanted to mention, too, most recently, at least that I know of, maybe there's more, journalists are being jailed and killed simply for doing their job, again, informing the public all across the globe. And most recently, 30-year-old journalist named Kim Wall. I mean, if you Google her name, you will see the trial is ongoing now. Went to Columbia University. In fact, there's a scholarship that just got put up in her name. I would suggest people go and check that out and potentially contribute to that. But she did just as everyone here in this room has done when they want to get interviewed. She emailed a source about a guy, I think he was crowdfunding another independent rocket to outer space or something like that, also had built and operated this mini submarine. Didn't hear back from the source for months. Finally does, just this past August, goes onto the submarine. Last images are her on top of the submarine with this guy as it's going away. And submarine never surfaces again. The police investigate, blah, blah, blah. The bottom line is this poor girl, 30 years old, a journalist, just trying to tell her story, gets, it's been admitted he dismembered her, but she was killed, potentially tortured, dismembered, and, her body parts were found all across a Nordic sea, up near Sweden. that is not someone who was famous. That was not someone who was even doing investigative journalism. That was just someone practicing the art and craft of journalism. And this happens way too often, and I don't think the public really know that.
Yeah. And I think Chris is bringing up a good point because, we were talking about local and now we're talking about global, but and we haven't even got into it much, which is crazy. But Trump's fake news, his fake news banters, some people like to use it as a joke now, but it's really not funny because when he uses that term, he's basically saying to autocrats and dictators in other countries, if the United States, the supposed bastion of human rights, the land where the freedom of the press is enshrined in the First Amendment, as Chris mentioned, if they can get away with sort of attacking journalists and the media as a whole, then I can do it too. You could have in Duterte in the Philippines, the man who's prosecuting a horrific war on drugs there, say fake news. People in other nations that don't have the freedom of press enshrined in the First Amendment can be attacked and said that with the government officials saying that what they're saying is fictitious news. Right. So it's important for people to understand that, we're not just babies who want to just, say, stop calling us names. This is really important because when it comes down to it, America is supposed to hold itself up as a beacon. And right now we're not doing that under this administration. And also because it sort of flows down on the local level. So we have the global impact and we also have the local level because maybe now people aren't going to trust their local newspaper. And these are newspapers that are struggling to remain financially solvent. They're not making a lot of money. Some of them may be running out of ads. Some of them might be nonprofits because they, there's just no advertisers out anymore. And trust me when I tell you, journalists are not getting paid enough to just come up with stories out of the blue. Journalists typically get low salaries. And all they're trying to do is talk to people on the ground and do the best that they can to their ability to report the facts as they know it. Obviously, there's times where people get the story wrong. And typically, news outlets will issue a correction. Sometimes they'll even retract a story. And then Trump will use that sometimes if a story is incorrect, if a portion of a story is incorrect, if a sentence of a story is incorrect, to say, see, fake news. But this is the same guy who said for months that he wanted to fire his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, was fake news, and just recently admitted that he's been thinking about it for some time. So, please, if you can, understand that U.S. journalists aren't sitting around at a table thinking that, hey, what can we come up with today? It really just doesn't happen that way.
Right. And where it does happen, that's not journalism.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. That's something else. That's news entertainment.
Right.
Let's just call it, that does happen, that there are people on extreme fringes that are seeking to push ideas or ideologies kind of with an editorial bent, with a goal in mind to sway the public. But that's not journalism. Right. And that doesn't mean that because they exist, that we don't.
Right.
We titled this episode Enemy of the American People, the U.S. government's war on journalism and press freedom. And for those of you who may not know, the title Enemy of the American People comes directly from our current president, who called journalists and the press the enemy of the American people. One of the things that this episode tries to get across is that, and I hope listeners come to the conclusion that anybody who calls an independent and free press the enemy of the American people, that's the enemy. The enemy of the American people, that's the phrase of a dictator. And I'm not calling the president a dictator. Again, this goes across party.
Autocratic tendencies.
Right. This is the current iteration of a multi-administration problem. So there's no, it's not zoning in on this guy.
Anybody, I don't care who you are, if it's the president, if it's your friend in the bar, if it's whoever calls a free and independent press or labels them the enemy of the people, the person saying that is the true enemy of the people.
Right.
Because it's the press that keeps them honest, that keeps the public informed, that exposes things against the public interest.
Right.
So, and I just want to mention one last thing that I think about every now and then. The climate right now, and Rashed, I think that you can agree to this. I mean, from us talking with Margot over at the Reporters Without Borders too, is so toxic right now from rhetoric like this. I think back to the campaign when there was just a local rally over here on the South Shore, Long Island, and it went on Facebook, and some of the people at some of the rallies taking place during the campaign were wearing T-shirts with a noose on it. It said, got rope, something along the lines of got rope, got tree, and then you see like a tree limb, need journalist. Like, that's the climate, you know, and I think, you know, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is another nonprofit for press freedoms, labeled 2017 as one of the most dangerous years for journalists globally. I think it was the record year for journalists jailed around the world. And, you know, as Trevor Tim says near the end of the episode, the United States has one of the freest presses in the entire globe. And if you look at that map from Reporters Without Borders, and it's color-coded to the level of press freedoms, and it's all, you know, a lot of it's based off of jails and murders and attacks. And we're right there in the lightest color. But that's the fuel that should get people fired up to defend those freedoms that we have now, and to do and speak out like we are on this episode to protect those freedoms and protect against that sort of chipping away and eroding away, because it's in the name of the people.
So let me ask, as we wrap up, as we often ask ourselves and try to impart onto our listeners, our good friends, what can a general public do? Some of these organizations, are they able to support them? Obviously support us. You can go to usnewsbeat.com/support and contribute to our endeavors so that we can continue telling these stories, but also action. Like what can we ask people? What are people asked to do to try and fight back?
Number one is what you had just said. I think going to these different groups, Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect Journalists, Freedom of the Press Foundation. There are several others. To me,
I'd also encourage just following them on Twitter, or just, you know, following them on Facebook, because you get all this information from them. Right. They report on this, and it helps. If this issue is important to you, or if you're starting to, like, you know, kind of pick your ears up a little bit and say, this is crazy, these are on the front lines of that fight, and they will make this very apparent.
And the goal, I think, is to open your mind to these things, you know, to open your eyes. And when you hear someone, I don't care who the hell it is, saying the media is the enemy of the people, or that's fake news, or you see a DOJ press release go out or something about a whistleblower, a leaker, look at the heart of it, you know, and think for yourself. Everyone has an agenda, especially elected officials. They'll everything they say is 100%, you know, fine-tuned. They're saying it for a reason. What's that reason?
Right. And what I would say to your question is there's a couple of things. One is just to be yourself a better citizen. You know, when you're reading news articles, you know, check the sources that they're putting in there. Oftentimes, articles include links, so you could navigate and check on this information yourself if you want to learn more. Also, when you hear someone yelling and screaming fake news, I want you to think about, what would you think if you're sitting in a courtroom and a guy, maybe just on the witness stand, or a guy who's on trial, throws up his hands in the air and says, I didn't do anything wrong. You know, typically that person did something wrong. So when a person is yelling fake news, just try to, you know, think about, why are they, you know, yelling and screaming? Why are they trying to deflect so much?
Maybe he's not a crook.
Maybe he's not a crook. And then the second thing, Chris mentioned supporting these great organizations that are trying to raise awareness about press freedoms. I would say support your local news organization.
That's great. Yes.
You know, there's, like I said, there's just not a lot of money out there right now for these local reporters, and they're the ones that are doing God's work on the ground, just getting you really the basic news that you need about your school district, about law enforcement, about political organizations, about, you know, the poor and the needy and the destitute, just things that make your community better. And one story that I would like to leave you guys with is when we were all local reporters once, and when Hurricane Sandy hit Long Island where we live, Chris and I went reporting, and we found...
I know the story that you're going to say.
We found a poor father who was throwing everything out of his house in a South Shore town. He didn't even have shoes. We put that in the story, and people came by and left shoes at his door. But even more meaningful to me is I met this man about a year later for an anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, only to learn that he, because of what he witnessed, the power of journalism, writing something and then just random people come and bring you shoes. He opened up a local news organization just because of that. So you know what? Support your local news outlets because they are the ones that probably need it the most. And support Newsbeat because we need to support our artists.
Yeah, and I guess my takeaway from all of this is, again, when I'm speaking to the average, some of my friends or just people on the internet, you hear this distrust of the media, this bias against media. Understand that not all media is created equal, right? Understand that not all news is real news. And again, the news entertainment business is strong. The force is strong in the news entertainment business. But there are a plethora of alternative news sources, independent news sources that aren't beholden to corporate sponsorship, aren't beholden to advertisers, aren't beholden to the government, or aren't beholden to a left-wing or a right-wing agenda. And I think what people have to do if they really want to understand what's happening in the world or in their community or in their region or with politics or with whatever is take some time to get familiar with all the different news sources that are available. And then use some creative thinking and some judgment to try to get a feel for what the real story is. Because again, sometimes the truth is presented to you from a left or a right, but the truth actually lives somewhere in the middle. And I think if you take in a lot of, and I tell people, okay, if you don't want to watch CNN every night or you think it's just a bunch of rambling talking heads, fine. Get the gist of what's happening and then go look for some of these sources. Again, it depends on who you are and what you're comfortable with, but look at the other sources. Look at the independent news sources, I don't want to name them because I don't want to, editorialize it, but they're out there. They're not feeding the echo chamber. They're not catering to a certain ideology. You'll get a good idea of what the real story is. There are journalists covering and digging in with no agenda, as you said, Chris, other than to get to the truth of the matter. And they're out there. You may not always see them. They don't always have the loudest voices. Like I said, 24-hour cable news is king in this land.
It's like a drug.
Right. But there are soldiers out there of the Constitution doing this work. Once again, thanks to Silent Night for putting it so eloquently in his lyrical contribution to this episode. Thanks to our voices in this episode. Just again, they've been arrested. They've put their lives on the line to bring truth to power, to bring truth.
Still speaking out.
And are still going, and they're still going strong. So we respect them. I respect you guys. I think that's it. We're good.
I'd like to close.
I think we went long enough.
We went pretty long.
I would just like to recite.
Looks like an hour and a half.
I would just
right?
like to recite one of Silent Night's verses from the
Absolutely.
episode. Just
take us out, SK via Chris.
These are the warriors, the voice of all the slaughtered and the imprisoned, risking their lives to get our stories heard. They go to war for words, heavily armed, ready and willing to defend against harm, for the people, a centerpiece, not the enemy, a shining light, an infantry, essentially.
That should be written on the museum or something.
Right? You couldn't say, he's actually pretty good writer, man. He puts us to shame. All right, listen, check out our full cover story if you do want, if this story appeals to you, touches you, if you'd like to learn a little bit more, where all of our episodes have feature-length cover stories, we like to call them, at our website, usnewsbeat.com. Of course, you already subscribe to this podcast, but tell all your friends, neighbors, supporters, and haters to do the same. We ask you to spend a little time checking out our support page, usnewsbeat.com/support, and see if you can maybe, give us a couple shillings to make sure that the fine literary works of Mr. Silent Night and our other artists and artists in residence are taken care of. And join us next time as we bring you new episodes and new episodes of BackBeat soon. Again, once again, my name is Manny Faces. I'm the producer and host of Newsbeat and BackBeat. From everyone here at Maury Creative Studios, including our Grand Poobah, Mr. Jed Maury himself, we thank you for listening. Catch us next time. Hit us up, usnewsbeat.com.
These are the medians who talk for those who couldn't speak. These are the warriors, the voice of all the slaughtered and the imprisoned, risking their lives to get our stories heard. They go to war for words, heavily armed, ready and willing to defend against harm. It's for the people. A centerpiece, not the enemy. A shining light in infantry, essentially.
The Newsbeat podcast is owned by Newsbeat, Inc. Visit us at usnewsbeat.com. The producer and host of Newsbeat is Manny Faces. Our editor-in-chief is Christopher Twarowski. Newsbeat's managing editor is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Our podcast and website are co-produced and managed by Morey Creative Studios. Newsbeat relies on listener support and grants. Artists that appear on the podcast are compensated for original material. To support Newsbeat or contribute to our Artist-in-Residence program, visit us at usnewsbeat.com and click on Support. Subscribe to Newsbeat by Morey Creative Studios wherever you download your podcasts by searching for Newsbeat.